Throughout history, Africa has been colonized, and during the scramble for Africa, virtually all of Africa was colonized by the colonial empires of Europe. When I speak of decolonization, I mean the process of when the colonial countries hauled their bureaucrats, politic ruling, resource extracting, and colonies out of Africa between the 1950s and the 1970s. Africa was fully re-established as an independent continent with independent countries by the 1970s. The Western decolonization of Africa was indirectly coming to an end when the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and England's Prime Minister Winston Churchill on the 12th of February 1941 met to discuss the post-war world. The result was the Atlantic Charter, a document which stated 8 ideal goals of how the world should be conducted. In the declaration by United Nations almost a year later, the allies of World War II pledged adherence to the Charter's principles. Churchill was presumably unaware of that the result of this would be decolonization. Now, before decolonization, obviously there was a juicy part of history, colonization. In the 18th and 19th century, Europe went through economic and social change from an agrarian culture into an industrial one. Industrialization is closely connected to modernization, technological development and innovation. Europeans took Africa to control sources of raw materials, and these were used to fuel their growing economy. But briefly, the largely established empires had demanded and claimed humongous areas of Africa and also Asia, and in 1884 Otto von Bismarck called in for a conference, the Berlin Conference. It was initiated for establishing international guidelines for the acquisition of land in the resourceful continent. But Europe didn't fail to colonize Africa until the 19th century because they didn't want to, they failed because they couldn't. This was mostly due to disease. Eventually, guns, steamships and medicine improved sufficiently, and thus Africa became Europe's domain. In between the Franco-Prussian War and the Great War, 23 million square kilometers was added to European domain, which equals 1/5 of the world's above sea level land area. Some of the reasons why colonization happened. Nationalism. Nationalism is basically to be proud of one's country. It was a matter of prestige to have colonies, and it boosted the self-esteem of the entire nation to have colonies. Resources. Resources fuel the economy of the country and are a great part of the whole concept of industrialization. Power. Power in this setting means the ability to affect, persuade, and or to be able to achieve one's goals. A country with colonies would have more to say in international settings and would be able to react with sanctions such as a trading embargo or military threats. Economic and military powers could be directly connected to colonies, though ideological power wouldn't necessarily come just because one nation had control over another. The white man's burden. Europeans often justified colonization by using the mentality of the white man's burden, an obligation to civilize the peoples of Africa. Now, what happened after World War II, to simplify, though not oversimplify, is that the empires weren't strong enough to maintain order in their colonies, as well as the allies kind of discarded the whole idea of colonization. They couldn't just say to the African soldiers who had fought along with them, "Thank you for helping us destroy Germany's colonial ambitions. Now, please return to your state of submission." In addition to all of this, African soldiers were sent directly back to Africa, where they would often use their newly acquired skills to support nationalistic movements. Many critics say that the process of African decolonization from the 1950s to the 1970s turned what was somewhat well-ordered and peaceful territory administered by efficient bureaucracies and legal traditions of the European empires, and were quickly substituted by violent, inefficient and corrupt socialist dictatorships or right-wing family dictatorships, who both had little regard for international rule of law and human rights, and riddled with civil turf wars, barbaric political purges, enormous refugee crises, famines and ethnic conflicts. The countries would often collapse on themselves and struggle with all of the mentioned. This is the case for many African countries to this very day. The borders that the Europeans had drawn often fitted badly with the cultural borders, resource borders, and the tribes that lived there, often resulting in internal wars, maybe even civil wars. One example of a disastrous result of the new borders is in Rwanda, where the very different tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, were combined into one state with the same administration. Emancipation, in the likes of the recent nation of South Sudan, may be the best way to somewhat solve the problem, if mediating between the groups does not work. There are many ways Africa, both as a continent and and as the individual countries it consists of, can better its situation, with the following pros and cons. In Norway, marginal tax rate for petroleum mining activity is 78%. Statoil operates in 41 countries, where they on average pay 25% or less, even as low as 8%, to the countries where they extract oil from. What is obvious here is that these countries need to understand that they are being exploited, that they need to raise their taxes so that they are the ones who benefit on their own resources, and that the corrupt men in their high positions need to be identified and prosecuted. This is what I consider to be Africa's most underrated, though most important option, since it's ridiculous that materials are mined and exported cheaply from Africa, then refined in richer countries to be sold at a much higher price. But yeah, that's right in the heart of colonization, modernization and industrialization, isn't it? Something else is that African countries should consider a full employment plan, so that every man that wishes to work shall get work, and they should tighten their grip on narcotics. Of course, every woman should have the same opportunity as well, but that's a whole new discussion and problem. This will presumably result in better life expectancy, more taxpayers without a criminal profession, better welfare, and so on. All of these should be on a plan stretching over maybe 30 to 40 years, so that it is sustainable, no drastic changes, and space for improvement and adjustment of the plan along the way. You may think that this resembles what Norway did in the time after World War II and when they struck oil, but history shows that this method has worked amazingly, and lots of African countries are somewhat in the same position as Norway was back then. Also, the rich countries could just stop being hypocrites that give money to Africa so they can improve their situation instead of just erasing or reducing their debt. Because for every dollar that is given to African aid, Africa has to pay $1.4 to pay debt. Many countries in Africa are in a position where they cannot possibly ever pay their debt unless large reforms and such occur. But though Africa has less freedom and lower levels of development, most countries shows to have consistent progress and growth, regardless of the effects of decolonization. Botswana has increased literacy percent with 1% of the entire population each year the last 15 years. Benin has had a better GDA growth than American and European countries. Kenya has drastically increased life expectancy. Mauritania has had a fall in 40% in infant mortality, and so on. All of these facts are spotty and fragile, but it still shows a positive progress, though a lot has to be done before Africa may even remotely resemble most of the European countries. Only time will tell what the effects of decolonization will be, since not enough time has passed since then to really come to a conclusion. But in general, the rich are getting richer, and the poor are also getting richer. Thanks.